How people lived in Renaissance cities, a gentle tour for sleep. Welcome to REM Sleep History. Tonight, we will take a very slow, quiet walk through a Renaissance city, not through its grand battles or famous scandals, but through its ordinary day. We will witness its awakening, its busy middle hours, and its gradual return to silence. From the perspective of the people who called its cobblestone streets home, imagine, if you will, a place in time. It is the 15th century in the heart of northern Italy. The city we are visiting could be Florence, or Siena, or Bologna. It is a compact world of stone and wood, nestled within a protective circle of high walls. As our tours begins, it is not yet dawn. The city is a silhouette, a sleeping form against a sky just beginning to soften from deep black to a velvety indigo blue. The city walls are not just a boundary, they are a living entity. They define everything. Within them is safety, community, law. Beyond them, the wildness of the countryside, the uncertainty of the road. The walls are pierced by heavy, iron-reinforced gates, which are now shut fast, guarded through the night by men whose figures are mere shadows in the torchlight. The city breathes in and out with the opening and closing of these gates, and within these walls lives a delicate, intricate hierarchy. At the very top, a small number of wealthy merchant families. The patricians, their palazzos, are like small fortresses on the main streets. Below them, a vibrant sea of artisans and shopkeepers, the members of powerful guilds for wool, silk, banking, and stone. And below them still, the vast majority, the popolo minuto, or the small people, servants, laborers, porters, and the poor. Their lives are woven together in a tight fabric, dependent on one another in countless invisible ways. The architecture itself tells the story of this social world. Streets are narrow, often shaded, designed for foot traffic and pack animals, not for grandeur. The upper stories of buildings might lean out over the street, making the sky a thin ribbon of light above. This is not an accident. It creates shade in the summer, and it allows families, in times of celebration or crisis, to literally reach out and touch the house across the way. Privacy, as we know it, is a rare commodity. Life is lived in the open, and in the close company of neighbors. The most important space of all is the public square, the piazza. This is the city's heart. It is a stage for politics, for commerce, for gossip, and for punishment. It is where proclamations are read, where markets spill over, where children play, and where, later, lovers might take a quiet stroll. Tonight, we will imagine the slow rhythm of a day in such a square, and in the warren of streets that feed into it. As we begin, the deepest dark of night is just beginning to loosen its hold. The air is cool and still. The only sounds are the soft, rhythmic flow of water from a fountain, perhaps the Fontana Maggiore, and the occasional distant call of a watchman assuring the sleeping citizens that all is well, that the gates are secure, that the night is passing as it should. Let us settle into this quiet and wait for the dawn to gently break. The first change is not a sound, but a quality of light. The deep blue of the sky pales just slightly at the eastern edge where the walls stand. A single bell rings, not loudly, but clearly. It is the Ave Maria bell from the monastery church, a call to prayer for the monks, and a signal for a few early risers to begin stirring in the baker's house. Attached to his shop, the fire in the great brick oven, which never fully went out, is now stoked with fresh, dry wood. The baker, his face warm with the growing flame, begins to mix his great mounds of dough. The scent of yesterday's bread, a faint, yeasty, comforting smell, still hangs in the air, soon to be replaced by the sharper, sweeter smell of today's loaves baking. With a heavy wooden groan that echoes down the empty streets, the great iron bolts of the city gates are drawn back. The two massive wooden doors swing inward. The night watch hands over his duty to the day guard. The first to enter are not people, but sounds and smells from the outside world. The cool, damp scent of the countryside, of dew on grass and turned earth, the distant lowing of cattle being driven to market. The first farmers appear, their carts laden with vegetables, with sacks of grain, with crates of squawking chickens. The city opens its mouth and takes its first sustenance of the day. Now the piazza begins its transformation. Stalls are unfolded, simple wooden trestles and canvas awnings. The farmers claim their traditional spots. A porter, back strong and legs thick from a lifetime of carrying, hefts a sack of wool from a cart and delivers it to the door of the wool guild's warehouse. The arte della lana, his breath forms small clouds in the still chilly morning air. Shopkeepers along the square unbolt their wooden shutters, lifting them up and securing them to the wall with iron hooks. The interior of a wool merchant's shop is revealed. Bolts of fine cloth scarlet azure, deep green stacked on shelves. A spice merchant's doorway releases a complex, exotic aroma. Peppercorns, cinnamon, cloves, scents from Egypt, from the Levant, from lands most here will never see, but will taste in their food. The sun is fully over the walls now. The city is washed in a gentle, golden light. The square is a tapestry of sound, but not yet chaotic. It is a low, busy murmur, the clink of coins, the call of a vendor praising his pears, the steady thump, thump, thump of a loom from a second-floor workshop. A lawyer, dressed in a long, dark robe, walks briskly across the square, a sheaf of papers under his arm, heading to the Palazzo della Signoria, the town hall. He nods to a silk merchant who is feeling the quality of a thread between his thumb and forefinger, his expression one of deep concentration. High above, from the open window of a patrician's palace, a young woman might look down on this scene. She is separated from it by height and status, but connected to it by need. The food for her table, the cloth for her dress, all comes from this bustling human river below. The sun climbs to its zenith. The light becomes flat and bright. The morning's urgency slows into the steady, patient rhythm of the day's work. In the dim interior of a tailor's shop, the master and his apprentice sit on stools, cross-legged. They work in silence, save for the soft shush-shush of needles pulling fine linen thread through rich velvet. Each stitch is tiny, precise. A single sleeve might take a day to sew. There is no hurry, only the slow, certain progress of the craft. In the nearby bottega of a woodcarver, the sound is different, the gentle tap of a mallet on a chisel. A curl of fragrant oak wood peels away. The carver is working on a choir stall for the cathedral. He does not need to look up often. His hands know the shape emerging from the wood. It is a meditation in action. While the men work in shops and squares, the rhythm within the homes continues. In a modest artisan's house, the wife or a servant draws water from the communal well in the courtyard. The bucket rises, dripping and cool. She will use it for cooking, for cleaning. Laundry is beaten in a stone trough. Simple, hearty food simmers in a pot over a small fire, a soup of beans, onions, and perhaps a piece of salt pork. The home is a place of production, too, of meals, of cloth spun from distaff to spindle, of children being minded. As the sun begins its long, sloping descent, the pace changes again. The great business of the day, the signing of contracts, the major purchases is done. Now comes a time for smaller transactions, for gossip, for social calls. Men might gather in a quiet corner of the square or in the shadow of the loggia to discuss the news, a shipment delayed by pirates in the Mediterranean, a marriage alliance being brokered between two families, the latest fresco being painted in the church. Apprentices, their masters' chores done, might have a rare hour to themselves. They could kick a leather ball in a side street, or simply sit on the steps of the cathedral, watching the people go by. The light is warmer now, casting long, dramatic shadows that stretch across the piazza's stones. The bell rings for vespers, the evening prayer. The market stalls are taken down. Unsold goods are packed away. The farmers' carts, now lighter, begin their creaking journey back out through the gates, which will soon close. Shop shutters are lowered and bolted once more. The tailor puts away his needle. The woodcarver lays down his chisel and blows the fine dust from his carving. From 100 kitchens, the smell of evening meals begins to waft into the streets. Onions, garlic, rosemary, the ubiquitous scent of olive oil warming in a pan. The public space of the city is gradually ceded back to the private space of the home. The loud murmur of the day softens into the isolated sounds of closing doors, of greetings called from upper windows, of a family gathering around a table. The blue of dusk deepens into the velvet black of night. The last trace of sunlight disappears behind the tiled rooftops. Stars emerge, pinpricks of light in a sky now freed from the smoke of daily fires. The city has completed its cycle. It has taken in, it has produced, it has traded, it has communed. Now it must rest. The gates are shut and locked with a final, resonant thud. The night watch takes its place, a solitary figure, pacing slowly, his lantern casting a small, swaying pool of light on the ancient stones. From our quiet vantage point, we can reflect on this daily rhythm. Life in this Renaissance city was not easy. It was filled with physical labor, with uncertainty, with the ever-present threat of disease or conflict. But it was also rooted in community, in visible purpose, in the tangible results of one's work. The baker saw his bread eaten. The carpenter saw his door hung. The merchant saw his cloth worn. There was a slowness, a predictability to the frame of the day, bounded by light and dark, by the ringing of bells, by the opening and closing of gates. Within that frame, the human drama, ambition, love, rivalry, kindness played out just as it does in our time. But the stage was smaller, closer, more intimate. Now the city sleeps. The fountain continues its gentle, endless flow. A lone candle flickers in a high window, then is extinguished. The night watchman's footsteps fade into the distance, becoming just a memory of a sound. The communal breath of the city is slow and deep and at rest. There is no more to be done today. The walls stand guard. The stars turn in their ancient course. All is quiet. Let this quiet be your quiet. Let the steady, slow rhythm of this past day ease the rhythms of your own mind. There is nothing to plan for, nothing to solve, only the deep, peaceful history of rest. The fountain flows. The night is calm. Education and self-improvement in the Renaissance, the quiet pursuit of a well-made mind.
Welcome to A Quiet Study. Tonight, we explore not a city or a daily routine, but an interior landscape, the Renaissance mind. Our topic is education and self-improvement, the slow, deliberate, and often deeply personal pursuit of knowledge, virtue, and eloquence. For the medieval world, learning was often directed toward a single, magnificent purpose, understanding God. It was the key to the divine. A path walked within the cloister, illuminated by scripture and the writings of the church fathers. But in the Renaissance, a new yet ancient idea took root and gently flourished. That education was also the key to a fully realized human life. It was the path to becoming what Leon Battista Alberti called the Uomo Universale, a universal man, not a knower of all things, but a person whose mind, character, body, and expression were cultivated, balanced, harmonious, and beautiful, a work of art in progress. This was a revolution of the spirit, but a quiet one. It happened not on battlefields, but in private studies lit by oil lamps, in the newly founded schools of humanist teachers, and in the elegant letters passed between friends across continents. It was fueled by the passionate recovery of ancient text, the eloquent philosophies of Cicero, the idealistic visions of Plato, the pragmatic histories of Livy and Plutarch. These were not dry old books, but lively, urgent voices from a past that seemed to speak directly to the present. offering tangible models of civic duty, personal integrity, and artistic expression. The past became a mirror, a mentor, and a challenge. The guiding ideal was humanitas, a Latin word that expanded to mean the full cultivation of our best human qualities. This was a curriculum for the soul. It meant grammar and rhetoric, to speak and write with clarity, precision, and persuasive grace. History and moral philosophy, to learn from the past and guide one's own actions with wisdom. Poetry and music, to refine the emotions and touch the ineffable. Even physical grace dancing, riding, bearing oneself with dignity was considered part of this all-encompassing education. The goal was not a specialized expert, but an integrated person. We will follow this journey of self-improvement as one might trace the growth of a tree. First, the deep roots, the foundational years of childhood in the disciplined, chant-filled schoolroom. Then, the sturdy trunk and spreading branches, the more self-directed pursuits of adulthood. In the library, the private scrittoio and the wider world. And finally, the flowering and fruiting, the application of this learning to the very art of living itself in conversation, in governance, in creation, and in quiet reflection. Our guides will be the patient schoolmaster, the curious young student, the wealthy patron who collects a library not for show but for use, the artist studying anatomy, and the adult scholar seeking wisdom for its own sake. Their tools are humble yet profound. Wax tablets, iron gall ink, rag paper, musical instruments, and above all, a disciplined and attentive mind. Let us join them now as the morning light falls across a simple page, the parchment rough under the fingers, and the lifelong work of shaping a self. Gently begins the foundation, the grammar school, and the rule of the wrought imaginer room, sparsely furnished, often cold. The air holds the mingled scents of wood smoke ink and the warm animal smell of wool from the children's clothes. A group of boys for this formal education was almost exclusively for boys sit on hard benches. They are of varying ages, from perhaps 7 to 14. Before them stands the magister, the schoolmaster, a figure of formidable authority, often with a birch rod resting against his desk as a silent promise of discipline. His first and most sacred task is to teach Latin, not the liturgical Latin of the Church, but the elegant classical Latin of Cicero, Virgil, and Horace. This was the gateway to all serious knowledge, the lingua franca of law, diplomacy, philosophy, and scripture. The boys learn by relentless rote and repetition. They chant declensions and conjugations in unison. Amo, amaz, amat, musi, muserum, musis. The sound is a low rhythmic murmur, like the humming of a beehive of learning. They write on reusable wax tablets with a stylus, smoothing out their mistakes with a flat enda, forgiving, tangible process. The scratch and scrape of metal on wax is a constant, gentle soundtrack to these early years. Memory is the muscle they are building, training the mind to hold and retrieve complex patterns. The tools of thought, rhetoric, imitation, and the commonplace book once, the foundations of grammar, are firmly laid. The student graduates to the art of rhetoric, the skill of using language effectively to inform, persuade, and delight. He is taught first to admire, then to meticulously imitate the great Roman orators and writers. He might copy out a passage from Cicero's orations, not just for the words, but for the structure, the rhythm, the cadence, the persuasive power. This was not seen as empty copying, but as learning from a master craftsman, absorbing his technique into one's very bones. The student practices composing his own letters and short speeches on classical themes. He learns the importance of inventio, finding something to say, dispositio, arranging it logically, and allocutio, expressing it with appropriate style and beauty. Alongside this, he begins his commonplace book. This was a personal treasury, a blank volume where he would copy down striking passages from his reading, a poignant line from Virgil, a wise maxim from Seneca, a brilliant argument from Cicero. These were indexed by theme: on friendship, on anger, on fortune, on death. This book became the student's own intellectual arsenal, a curated garden of thoughts to be visited, cross-referenced, and used to cultivate his own ideas. The mind was being trained, not just to consume, but to collect, organize, and create. The expansion, history as moral teacher, and poetry as soul fudas, the student advances. His world expands dramatically through texts. He reads the histories of Livy and Tacitus, not merely for chronicles of events, but as rich tapestries of human virtue and vice, from which to draw moral and political lessons. He reads the poetry of Virgil and Ovid, training his ear for meter, metaphor, and the subtle music of language, while exploring the full spectrum of human emotion, love, loss, and myth. Most importantly, he engages with the moral philosophers like Seneca, the Stoic, and, later, the recovered dialogues of Plato. Here, education transforms into self-improvement in its deepest sense. The student is no longer just learning facts. He is learning how to live. He contemplates timeless questions of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. He writes essays in his copybook, arguing a point of philosophy, wrestling with these ideas until they become his own. The scratching of the quill is slower here, more thoughtful, pausing frequently as the young mind grapples with concepts that will shape his character for a lifetime. the education of the body. The ideal of a sound mind in a sound body. The Renaissance ideal was not of a pale, frail scholar, but of a vigorous, graceful individual. For the nobility and aspiring gentry, education extended to the body. This was the realm of the dancing master, teaching the complex, patterned steps of the Bas Dongsa lesson in social grace, rhythm, and spatial awareness. It included the riding master, for horsemanship was a symbol of nobility and military readiness. It might encompass fencing, a martial art that demanded precision, timing, and cool judgment. Even casual games like tennis or poloni, an early form of handball, were encouraged. The principle, drawn from the ancients, was mens sana in corpore sano, a healthy mind in a healthy body. Physical poise was seen as an outer reflection of inner balance. The adult scholar. The private library as a universe in a room for the privileged few. Education did not end with childhood. The Renaissance gentleman, the exceptional, learned woman like Isabella d'Este or Vittoria Colonnasa, learning as a lifelong, sacred pursuit. The heart of this pursuit was the private library or study. This was a small, intimate, often exquisitely decorated room, a sanctuary. It was lined with bookshelves or cabinets with doors that closed, protecting the precious volumes within. Books were treasures, bound in leather over wooden boards, fastened with brass clasps. Our scholar, perhaps a merchant prince or a retired diplomat, retreats here for hours. He reads a newly printed edition of Plato's Symposium, his finger tracing the lines of crisp black lettering. He corresponds with a humanist in Nuremberg or Antwerp, exchanging ideas, critiquing each other's Latin style, and sharing the thrill of a newfound manuscript. His learning is now driven by pure personal curiosity, a love of dialogue, and the desire for sapientia. Wisdom, a deeper understanding that transcends mere knowledge. His library is a universe he can hold in his hands and explore at his own unhurried pace. The practice of collecting, a cabinet of conversation self-improvement, was also a social and sensory endeavor. A cultured patron collected not only books, but also antiquities, ancient Roman coins bearing the profiles of emperors, fragments of carved marble sculpture, inscribed gemstones. They collected natural wonders, a piece of coral, a knotless shell from distant seas, a dried specimen of an exotic plant. This was the Wunderkammer, the cabinet of curiosities. Each item was a conversation piece, a tangible connection to the past or the wonders of the natural world. It served as a physical prompt for discussion about history, art, nature, and God's creation. Collecting was an active form of learning, a way of structuring and making sense of the world's diversity. Conversation as an art form, the salon and the gardening, the evenings. This accumulated learning found its most delightful application, cultivated conversation. In the salon of a palace or the shaded alleys of a garden, men and women would gather. The ideal was to discuss literature, art, philosophy, and current events with grace, wit, and eloquence. This was the performance of one's education, not to show off, but to elevate social interaction into an art form itself. It was the practice of civilite and sprezzatura, nonchalant mastery, using one's improved self to improve the company one kept. A successful evening was measured not by the food served, but by the quality of the talk, the spark of a new idea, the pleasure of a well-turned phrase, the inner garden, meditation, journaling, and the examination of conscience, the quietest, most profound form of self-improvement was entirely private, influenced by both Christian monastic practices and Stoic philosophy. The educated Renaissance individual would practice daily meditation or journaling. This was the regular, gentle examination of one's own conscience and conduct. Our scholar might, in the last light of the day, take out a small, private diary, separate from his commonplace book. In it, he records not the day's events, but his inner weather, a reflection on a moment of anger poorly managed, resolve to practice patience, a note on how a line from Marcus Aurelius, "You have power over your mind," not outside events, provided solace in a difficulty, a resolve to act with more generosity tomorrow. This was the ultimate internalization, using learning to tend to one's own character, to prune vice and cultivate virtue, as one would patiently tend a delicate plant in a walled garden. It was the work of forging an authentic self. The limits and the light, a privileged pursuit, is important to rest here. In the quiet truth that this beautiful ideal was just the tan ideal and a profoundly exclusive one. It was available only to a tiny, almost entirely male, wealthy, and urban segment of society. The vast majority of people, peasants, laborers, most women had no access to this world of books, private studies, and philosophical leisure. Their education was in craft, in farming, in the oral traditions of their community, in survival. The Renaissance, for all its glory, rested on their shoulders. Yet, the light of this ideal, however narrowly cast, irrevocably changed the world. It created a new, enduring value for the individual mind, for critical thought, for elegance of expression, and for the dignity of secular life. It wove the powerful idea that to be human was to be a project, a work of art that one was responsible for, a self that could be thoughtfully, deliberately, and beautifully made. So what can we, listening in the quiet of our own night, take from this quiet pursuit? The Renaissance scholar sought self-improvement not primarily for wealth, status, or external validation, but for fulfillment and freedom. To live, as the ancients said, according to nature, which meant according to our highest reasoning, creative nature. It was an education for its own sake, a dialogue with the greatest minds across time, a private liberation. The tools of this liberation were patience and repetition, the slow, tactile memorization of a poem, the careful, deliberate copying of a perfect sentence until its rhythm became your own, the patient, often solitary, rereading of a difficult passage until understanding dawned like a slow sunrise. There was no rush. Mastery was acknowledged as a lifelong journey, and the journey itself, the daily practice, the small accumulations of insight was the point in our modern world of endless, fragmented information and the constant pressure of self-optimization. The Renaissance model offers a different, slower, more integrated path. It suggests that true improvement is not about consuming more content, but about absorbing deeply. It is not about a frantic building of a resume, but a calm, persistent cultivation of a soul. It values the quality of attention over the quantity of facts, the depth of understanding over the speed of acquisition, and the integration of knowledge into a coherent, virtuous life. The scratch of the quill, the turning of the heavy page, the silent, prolonged pause in the library, in harmony with itself and the wisdom of the past. Tonight, let that older, slower rhythm be yours. There is no test to pass, no lesson to memorize, no performance to give. Only the gentle, reassuring model of a mind tending to itself, thoughtfully, patiently, and without haste. The heavy book is closed for the evening, its clasp fastened. The ink in the well has dried to a dark skin. The freshly written words on the page are setting, their meaning seeping into the paper and the memory alike. The thoughts that were so urgently explored can now be set aside, allowed to settle in the subconscious like leaves drifting to the bottom of a still pond. The pursuit of a well-made mind yields, for now, to the simple, restorative need for a quiet mind. The active seeking softens into receptive being. The study is dark. The last candle, a pool of wax with a drowned wick, is extinguished. The knowledge, the questions, the aspirations are all safely stored in the ordered shelves, in the filled pages of the commonplace book, and in the deepened heart, ready for another day's gentle engagement. Now, the only task left is the one the scholars also knew well, the surrender to rest, where the mind's diligent work is continued by the soul in the language of dreams, and the whole self is renewed in the generous, forgiving dark.
The birth of Renaissance art, a gentle history, perspective, light, and a new humanity.
Welcome to a quiet revolution, centuries in the making. Tonight, we explore the birth of Renaissance art not as a sudden explosion, but as a slow, deliberate turning of the human gaze, a reorientation of heart and mind that forever changed how we see our world and ourselves. For the 3 centuries preceding this shift, the dominant visual language of Europe was the Gothic inheritor of the Byzantine tradition. In the soaring cathedrals and the precious, jewel-like pages of illuminated manuscripts, the purpose of art was overwhelmingly theological. Figures were not meant to be human, but holy vessels. They were symbols, stylized, flat, often backed with radiant gold leaf that represented the timeless, unshadowed light of the divine realm. They existed outside of earthly space and mortal time. A painting was a mappa mundi of faith, a window to heaven, a glimpse of an eternal, perfect order that stood in stark contrast to our flawed, transient, earthly perception. But then, in the prosperous city-states of central and northern Italy in the late 13th and 14th centuries, a new audacious desire began to stir. It was the desire to see and to show the sacred story within the world as it appeared to the human eye. This was a profound philosophical and theological shift from symbolism to naturalism, from depicting immutable ideas to depicting the divine, immanent in the tangible, the fallible, the breathtakingly real. It was a movement from a God-centric universe to one where humanity, made in God's image, became a worthy subject of intense study and celebration. This awakening, which scholars would later call the Renascita or rebirth, did not happen in a day or by a single hand. It was a dawning, a series of interconnected discoveries in perception, technique, and philosophy made across the 14th and 15th centuries, the Trecento and Quattrocento. It was a revolution fueled by 3 converging historical forces. First, a new socioeconomic reality, the rise of a wealthy, literate merchant banker class, the popolo grasso, in cities like Florence, Siena, and Venice, who sought to legitimize their power through civic and religious patronage, commissioning art that reflected their world. Second, a rediscovered classical heritage, the intense study of surviving Roman ruins, sculptures, and, crucially, newly recovered texts from philosophers like Plato, which offered a human-centered model of virtue and beauty. And third, a series of brilliant, empirical, and technical solutions to fundamental problems of representation. How to depict logical space, convincing form, and authentic emotion. Our guides tonight will not just be the famous artists, but the very tools, theories, and social structures that enabled them. We will examine the linear perspective that constructed rational, immersive space from mathematics and observed reality. The chiaroscuro and sfumato that sculpted living form from the subtle play of light and shadow. The study of anatomy that sought to understand the divine engineering of the body. The Bottega system, the collaborative workshop that was the engine of artistic production. And always the silent partner, the patron, whose desires for commemoration, devotion, and prestige directed the course of art. We will trace this gentle history as one might watch a fresco dry, slowly, patiently, observing the colors as they bond chemically with the plaster, settling into their final, glorious, permanent form. We begin not with a finished masterpiece, but with a hesitant, pivotal step away from tradition. In the dim, dusty light of a wooden scaffold, high up in the vault of a humble chapel in Padua, with the sharp, mineral smell of wet intonaco and the earthy scent of ground pigments hanging in the cool air. Let us go there now, to the very beginning of the new way of seeing. The precursors, Cimabue, and the flicker of life. To understand the revolution, we must first see what it revolted against. In the late 13th century, the master painter Cimabue was celebrated for works like the Santa Trinita Madonna. It is majestic, solemn, and deeply Byzantine. The Virgin's throne recedes with a primitive perspective. The gold background shines. The figures are elongated and hieratic. Yet, look closely. In the faces of the attendant angels, there is a subtle softness, a slight turn of the head that hints at individual presence. Cimabue's great pupil would take this flicker of life and fan it into a flame. That pupil was Giotto, the first glimmer. Giotto, di Bondone, and the architecture of a motion hour scene is the Scrove Denis or Arena Chapel in Padua. Circa 1305, the artist is Giotto, commissioned by the wealthy banker Enrico Scrovegni. Giotto and his workshop cover every surface with frescoes narrating the lives of the Virgin and Christ. Here, the break is decisive. Giotto's figures are volumetric. They are not drawn. They are constructed like architecture. Their feet press onto the ground with palpable weight. You feel the solidity of the earth beneath them. Their robes don't just hang. They drape and fold with a real sense of cloth, of a body with mass and warmth moving beneath the fabric. Look at the lamentation of Christ. The angels above are not serene symbols. They wail with a raw human grief, their faces contorted, their bodies anguished. The mourners below are a pyramid of sorrow, each reaction unique from Mary's silent, encompassing embrace to the stark despair of the woman throwing her arms back. Giotto's quiet revolution was psychological and spatial gravity. He organized his figures within a shallow, stage-like space, using simplified landscapes and architectural elements to ground the action. He asked his figures to act, to feel, to occupy a space that, while not yet perfectly measured, felt emotionally and physically true. It was the first crucial crack in the flat, symbolic wall. He gave theological narrative a human body that obeyed the same pull of the earth as our own. The Sienese counterpoint, Duccio's lyricism, and the Bottega system, while Giotto worked in Florence and Padua. The rival Republic of Siena fostered a parallel but distinct path. Duccio di Bua n'Insegna, in his great Mista altarpiece, retained the Gothic love for line, elegant pattern, and luminous color. His figures are more graceful, less monumental than Giotto's. Yet, in the narrative panels on the back, Duccio displays a masterful, if intuitive, sense of space and storytelling. This highlights a key truth. The Renaissance was not a monolith. Different city-states, with different political structures and devotional traditions, nurtured different artistic dialects. This work was not created in isolation. It was the product of the bottega, the workshop. The master, be it Giotto, Duccio, or later Verrocchio, was a businessman and master craftsman. He secured commissions, designed the overall composition, the disegno, and painted the crucial faces and hands. Apprentices, after years of grinding pigments, preparing panels, and transferring drawings, would paint less important areas, drapery, backgrounds, decorative details. Art was a collaborative, hierarchical trade, a fact often obscured by our modern myth of the solitary genius. The century of plague and reflection, the Black Death and the triumph of death. Forward march of art was not linear. The cataclysm of the Black Death, 1348, which wiped out a third of Europe's population, cast a long shadow. A new, stark sensibility emerged, focused on mortality and penitence. In frescoes like the Triumph of Death in Pisa's Camposanto, we see graphic, grim reminders of life's fragility. Yet, even here, the observational lessons of Giotto persisted. The decaying corpses, the anguished faces of the living, they are rendered with a horrifying, specific realism. The crisis deepened the human experience art sought to convey, adding a layer of poignant urgency to the project of representing life truthfully. The architect's secret, Brunelleschi, mathematics, and the single point now move forward a century to Florence. The year is circa 1415. The city was engaged in a monumental struggle to crown its cathedral with a dome. A task many thought impossible. The man who solved it, Filippo Brunelleschi, was an architect, goldsmith, an engineer, obsessed with geometry, Roman construction, and optics. His genius was not just structural, but visual, fascinated by the problem of representing depth. He performed a legendary experiment. He painted a meticulously precise picture of the Florence Baptistery on a small wooden panel as seen from the cathedral doorway. Then he drilled a tiny hole at the painting's vanishing point. Holding the panel with its back to him, he looked through the hole at a mirror which reflected his painting. When he moved the mirror aside, the real baptistry came into view, aligning in perfect, breathtaking continuity with the painted one. He had demonstrated the geometrical principles of single-point, linear perspective. This was not just a painter's trick. It was a new cosmology, deeply aligned with the humanist spirit. It placed the individual observer at the stable, rational center of a measurable, coherent universe. For the first time, a painting could be a flawless, logical extension of one's own singular viewpoint. The world outside and the world inside the picture could share the same immutable mathematical laws. The painter's manual, Alberti's window, and the theory of art Brunelleschi was secretive. But his discovery was too powerful to contain. A generation later, the polymath Leon Battista Alberti Arcata, mathematician, playwright, codified it for all artists. In his seminal treatise, Della Pittura on Painting, 1435, written in the vernacular Italian to reach craftsmen directly, he described the painting surface not as a decorative plane, but as a finestra aperta, an open window through which we look into a depicted world. He gave artists a practical, repeatable tool, the costruzione legittima, legitimate construction. An artist would first establish a horizon line at eye level, then place a central vanishing point upon it. Using a network of orthogonals, diagonal lines receding to that point, and transversals, parallel lines crossing them, he could construct a perfect receding grid for a tiled floor or a coffered ceiling. Space itself became the first subject, deep, inviting, rational, and serene. This mathematical framework liberated artists to populate their scenes with figures and buildings that existed in consistent relation to one another and to the viewer. The sculptor's gaze, Donatello, contrapposto, and the revival of the bronze cast-while painters were solving space. Sculptors led the charge in rediscovering the body. They studied not just live models, but the broken statues unearthed from Roman ruins. The key lesson was contrapposto, the relaxed, natural stance where the body's weight rests on one leg, ponderation, causing the hip to tilt and the shoulders to counterbalance, creating a graceful, sinuous S-curve of latent movement. Donatello embodied this revival. His David c. 1440s, commissioned by the Medici, is revolutionary. It is the first freestanding, life-sized nude bronze cast since antiquity. This is not a remote, saintly symbol. This is a thoughtful, almost androgynous adolescent standing in a soft human contrapposto, his foot resting casually on the head of Goliath. A faint, enigmatic smile on his lips. He is contemplative, real, his polished bronze surface alive with light. Donatello's later Mary Magdalene in wood is equally radical, a harrowing, hyperrealistic depiction of ascetic decay, a study in emotional and physical extremity. The study of anatomy became an essential pilgrimage. Artists like Antonio del Pollaiuolo and later Leonardo da Vinci attended dissections, sketching muscles and bones, seeking to understand the divine machinery beneath the skin. The body was no longer a mere vessel for the soul. It was a magnificent, articulate, and worthy creation in its own right. The alchemy of light and medium, from tempera to oil, the final, magical ingredient in this new vision was light. Medieval illumination often meant literal gold leaf, a material that shone with its own celestial, internal light, denying the shadows of the earthly world. The Renaissance sought to depict light falling upon things from a specific source, modeling form through contrast. This is chiaroscuro from chiaro light and scuro dark, Masaccio. In his Brancacci Chapel, frescoes 1420s, was a pioneer. In the tribute money and the expulsion from paradise, his figures, painted in fresco, have a monumental solidity. They are carved by light itself. A single, consistent, raking light models their forms, casting believable shadows that anchor them to the ground. The angel expelling Adam and Eve is a dazzling study in foreshortening, its body receding dramatically into space. This pursuit of luminous reality was supercharged by the gradual adoption of oil painting, a technique perfected in the workshops of Flanders by artists like Jan van Eyck. Northern European panel paintings, traded in Italian ports, astounded viewers with their mirror-like finish, microscopic detail, and breathtaking luminosity. Unlike the quick-drying matte finish of egg tempura, oils dried slowly. They could be blended on the panel, layered in thin, translucent glazes, velature. Each glaze acted like a filter, deepening colors and allowing light to pass through and reflect back from the bright ground below, creating a glow no tempera could match. Skin gained a translucent warmth, the blush of life beneath the surface. A velvet robe could show 1,000 deep, light-swallowing folds, its richness almost tactile. By the late 15th century, Venetian artists like Giovanni Bellini would master the oil technique, using it to depict the very moisture in the air, the haze of a distant landscape, the soft flesh of a Madonna. The very atmosphere in a painting became palpable. The patron's face, portraiture, and the rise of the secular individual who financed this revolution. A new, confident elite, wealthy merchant bankers like the Medici and Strozzi in Florence, the Montefeltro in Urbino, the Gonzaga in Mantua. Humanist scholars and churchmen like Pope Sixtus IV were also crucial patrons. They wanted art that celebrated not only God and the Church, but also their city, their learning, their lineage, and themselves. This fueled the rise of the independent portrait. Early profiles inspired by Roman imperial coins and medals conveyed stern, timeless dignity. For example, Piero della Francesca's Duke and Duchess of Urbino. But the psychological breakthrough was the three-quarter view portrait. It captured a moment of quiet thought, a flicker of personality, a direct, thoughtful gaze that seems to engage the viewer across the centuries. Domenico Ghirlandaio painted the solid, shrewd faces of Florentine burghers. Antonello da Messina, influenced by Flemish models, brought an unprecedented psychological depth and luminosity to the form. In these faces, we see the Renaissance, individual, self-aware, reflective, anchored in their specific time and place, conscious of their legacy. The painting was no longer just a holy object. It was a mirror, a statement, a form of secular immortality, the synthesis of knowledge. Leonardo da Vinci and the painter as scientist all. These threads, perspective, anatomy, chiaroscuro, empirical observation were woven together in the mind of Leonardo da Vinci. For Leonardo, painting was the supreme science, for it required and communicated knowledge of all the visible world. His notebooks are a torrent of interdisciplinary inquiry, studies of turbulent water, the growth of plants, the flight of birds, the geometry of shadows, the muscles of a smile in his unfinished adoration of the Magi, 1481. We see a revolutionary compositional vortex, with figures swirling around the central holy group within a vast, ruined architectural space, demonstrating masterful perspective and anatomical study. In The Virgin of the Rocks, he introduces sfumato, the smoky blending of tones and exudes that forms emerge from shadow into light without a harsh contour, mimicking how the human eye actually sees. His fresco of the Last Supper, 1490s, is a masterpiece of psychological drama and spatial clarity. Though his experimental oil tempera mix on dry plaster would lead to its rapid physical decay, Leonardo embodied the ultimate Renaissance ideal, the artist as a limitless seeker of knowledge, for whom art was the highest form of understanding, the apex of harmony. Raphael, Michelangelo, and the High Renaissance in the first decades of the 16th century. The center of patronage shifted from Florence to Papal Rome. Here, Under Popes Julius II and Leo X, art reached a brief, sublime synthesis known as the High Renaissance. Raphael Sanzio became the master of perfect harmony, balance, and idealized beauty. In works like the School of Athens in the Vatican stands, he created a majestic, perspectively perfect architectural setting where the great philosophers of antiquity converse, their gestures and groupings forming a serene, rhythmic composition. His Madonnas are the epitome of graceful, human divinity. Michelangelo Buonarroti, primarily a sculptor in his own mind, forced the human form to express titanic spiritual and emotional power. His David 1501 to 1504 is not Donatello's thoughtful youth, but a colossal, alert, and heroic embodiment of the Florentine Republican ideal. On the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he merged architecture, sculpture, and painting, depicting the epic of creation through the lens of the human body, his figures possessing a dynamic, tortured grandeur, terribilita, that pushed anatomy into the realm of the sublime. This period represented a peak of confidence, belief that, through art, the ideals of classical beauty, Christian theology, and human genius could be fused into a perfect, harmonious whole. Yet, this harmony would soon be shattered. The legacy and the turn, mannerism and the end of certainty. Ideals of balance and naturalism established in the 15th century did not simply end. They were transformed. The trauma of the 1527 sack of Rome by imperial troops, the religious upheaval of the Reformation, and a growing sense of political crisis led to a new style, mannerism. Artists like Pontormo, Rosso, Fiorentino, and Parmigianino deliberately distorted proportions, used acidic, unnatural colors, and composed figures in complex, spiraling poses, figura serpentinata. The calm, rational space of the Renaissance gave way to crowded, ambiguous, and often unsettling scenes. This was not a rejection of Renaissance learning, but an anxious, brilliant commentary upon it, proving that the tools of perspective and anatomy could express dislocation as powerfully as they had expressed order. This gentle, yet monumental, revolution was, at its core, an act of profound love, curiosity, and attention. A love for the physical world in all its glorious, intricate detail, the way a hand curls around a book, the way shadow pools in the fold of a neck, the way a country road diminishes into the hazy blue distance of a sfumato landscape. It was a declaration deeply rooted in both Christian and Neoplatonic thought, that to look closely, patiently, and reverently at God's creation, the human form, the play of light on a wall, the geometric harmony inherent in space, was itself the highest form of devotion and understanding. As the humanist philosopher Marsilio Ficino proclaimed, "Beauty is the splendor of the divine truth. The artist's bottega became a laboratory of seeing. Each painting, each sculpture, was a series of empirical questions answered with brush, chisel, and compass. How do we truly stand? How does light travel and caress a form? How does the world arrange itself before our own singular, precious, and subjective point of view? They replaced theological assumption with direct observation, universal symbol with individual sensation. For us, listening in the comforting dark, this history offers a beautiful, silent model for rest. It is a story about focused perception, about choosing, moment by moment, to see not only what you are told is there, but what actually is there in all its nuanced reality. The weary, lined face of an old model, the exact shifting color of the afternoon sky over Florence, the gentle, inevitable, logical pull of all lines toward a silent, unifying point on the horizon of your own perception. You can let go of that intense, observational focus now. You do not need to solve the geometry of your room or analyze the chiaroscuro on your eyelids. The artist from the anonymous apprentices grinding lapis lazuli to Giotto, Brunelleschi, Donatello, Van Eyck, Leonardo, and Michelangelo did that patient, glorious, collective work for us all. They forged a new visual language that allowed us to see a world made whole, deep, coherent, and achingly beautiful. Our task now is not to analyze, but simply to drift within the reality they helped unveil, to let their hard-won clarity soften the edges of our own mental canvas. So, let the wooden scaffolding of their discoveries quietly fade from view. Let the precise, ruled lines of perspective soften, blur, and melt away. The meticulous drawing, the synopia, is hidden under the final layer of plaster. The fresco on the wall, it's dry, its colors now bonded for eternity. The final, thin glaze of linseed oil has hardened, capturing for all time a moment of light that will never fade, a shadow that will never move. The workshop is silent and dark. The brushes are cleaned and shelved. The precious pigment salt, marine, vermilion, malachite are sealed in their bladders. The chisels are still. The models have put on their ordinary clothes and gone home. The long, patient, collective gaze of the Renaissance, that gaze of wonder, of calculation, of love, spanning nearly 3 centuries, has ended its day's work, leaving behind only its beautiful, settled, and permanent proof in stone and pigment. Now, your own gaze can turn gently inward, away from the window on the world, and toward the soft, dark, limitless, and forgiving perspective of sleep. Your mind's eye can close its shutter, its work of seeing done, ready to be nourished in a velvet dark where all lines converge, all forms relax, and a different, older kind of wisdom, wordless, boundless, and deep takes over. The revolution is complete. Rest now within the world it made visible.
The fabric of society, clothing, wool, and silk in the Renaissance. Welcome to the weave of the past. Tonight, we explore a world you could touch, smell, and hear, a world worn on the body. Our subject is the very fabric of Renaissance society. In the most literal sense, clothing, wool, and silk. In our modern age, clothing is often a matter of personal expression, of seasonal trends. In the Renaissance, it was a coded language of visibility. It was a visual, tactile dialect that instantly communicated a detailed story of wealth, profession, geographic origin, marital status, and even moral standing. To understand what people wore is to understand the very threads of their existence, the agrarian economics of the sheep pasture, the perilous global routes of the spice caravan, the strict, paranoid decrees of the town council, and the intimate, trusting touch of the tailor's hand upon your shoulder during a fitting. Clothing began not in a boutique, but in a landscape. For perhaps 90% of Europeans, it began with the sheep. Wool was not just a commodity, it was the petroleum, the lifeblood, the foundational currency of the Renaissance economy. It built the fortunes of the Medici in Florence, funded the civic pride of Bruges, and floated the maritime empire of Venice. It was a humble, earthy beginning. Grassy hills under vast skies, bleating flocks moving with the seasons, and the annual shearing that left great, greasy piles of fleece smelling of lanolin dung, an open-air dot. But for the elite, the prince, the cardinal, the newly ennobled banker, clothing began with a whispered dream of luxury, with a thread of impossible, luminous fineness. Silk spoke of a dizzyingly long, fragile journey, from mulberry groves in China or the workshops of Persia, across deserts and pirate-haunted seas, to the bustling, secretive warehouses of Venice and Lucca. It was the ultimate symbol of global connection, exotic knowledge, and untouchable wealth. A single sleeve could cost more than a peasant's house. And between these two poles, the sturdy, local, democratic wool and the precious, imported, aristocratic silk entire, intricate universe of social identity, aspiration, and law was woven, stitch by deliberate stitch. We will follow this profound journey tonight, from the ground to the body. We will begin with the raw, earthy foundations of wool, walking through its astonishingly long, multi-stage transformation from filthy fleece to humble cloth. We will then follow the luminous, transcontinental thread of silk, from worm to wondrous fabric. We will immerse ourselves in the vibrant, foul-smelling alchemy of the dye vat, where alchemists in aprons conjured colors from insects, roots, and metals. We will explore the tailor's geometry, cutting social shapes from expensive cloth. And we will hear the stern voice of the law, which tried to dictate the color of your hose and the width of your sleeve. Our guides will be the solitary shepherd, the calloused wool washer, the rhythmic weaver, the secretive silk riller, the chemical dyer, the perilous merchant, the meticulous tailor, and the watchful city official. Their combined, often anonymous labor, spanning continents and years, culminated in the simple daily act of getting dressed each morning. Let us begin where the process did for most, in the quiet, misty chill of the countryside, at the absolute, unrefined start. The wool-eye, the shepherd's solitary year-aware first sound is not the loom, but the wind over rolling hills, the gentle, constant bat of a flock of several hundred sheep. The shepherd, wrapped in a thick, rough Pagello cloak of undyed greasy wool, is a figure of ancient cyclical rhythm, often living in a solitary hut for months. His entire year is tied to the needs of his flock. In spring, the crucial shearing, the sheep are caught, their legs gently bound. With special wide-bladed shears, he slices close to the skin in one long curling stroke, the fleece peeling away in a single, heavy, oily mat. This grease, lanolin, has its own pungent organic scent. The raw fleece is a universe of impurities, heavy with dirt, twigs, burrs, and the sweat of a year's growth. This is the absolute, unrefined beginning of wealth. The wool too, sorting, beating, and the first cleansing the fleece does not go straight to the river. First, it is sorted by skilled hands in a dusty wool shed. The finest, softest wool from the sheep's shoulders is separated from the coarser, hairier wool, from its legs and belly. This grading determines its destiny and price. Then comes the willowing or beating. The fleece is laid on a hurdle or a taut net and beaten with flexible sticks to loosen the heaviest dirt and sand. A cloud of dust rising with each thwack. Only then is it ready for the water. The wool 3. The river's brutal baptism. The fleece is taken in sacks to a fast-flowing cold stream. Here, in wooden troughs or simply in stone-lined pits, it undergoes its first true baptism. It is soaked, then trodden by foot or pounded with wooden paddles by wool washers. Their legs often stained in raw from the alkaline water and lanolin. This is brutally physical work, done in all weather. The grease and grime slough off, swirling downstream. The clean wool, now lighter and fluffier, is spread on hurdles or clean grass to dry in the sun and wind. Turning from brown to a creamy off-white, it has lost half its weight in filth. The wool for carding, combing, and the alignment of chaos once dry. The wool must be untangled and aligned. For most wool, this means carding. The worker takes 2 wooden paddles, studded with wire teeth cards, pulling a clump of wool repeatedly between them. She teases and aligns the chaotic fibers into a uniform, fluffy roll called a roll. For the finest wool intended for worsted cloth, a more intensive process called combing is used. Heated, long-toothed metal combs pull through the wool, removing all short fibers and leaving only the long parallel tops, ready for a smooth, strong thread. This is skilled, repetitive labor, most often done by women in their homes or in small workshops. The wool V, the hypnotic whirl of the spindle now. The spinner takes over. She, for this quintessential domestic labor, was the economic backbone of countless household sits, with her distaff and spindle. The distaff, a long stick tucked under her arm or stuck in her belt, holds the rolag. With a deft, practiced flick of her fingers, she draws out a continuous stream of fibers, twisting them between thumb and forefinger, then sets the weighted spindle whirling like a top below. The twist travels up the drafted fibers, creating a strong, continuous thread which she winds onto the spindle. The motion is hypnotic, circular, endless. A good spinner could produce miles of thread in a week. This was the first great alchemy, chaos into order, fragile fluff into resilient thread. The wool vie, the weaver's loom, heartbeat of the city. The thread, now wound into skeins, is delivered to the weaver's workshop, often on the ground floor of a tall, narrow house. His space is dominated by the great timber frame horizontal loom, a machine of sublime complexity. The vertical warp threads, hundreds of them, are measured, sized with starch, and painstakingly threaded through heddles onto the loom beam, stretched taut as a drum. The weaver sits on a bench, his feet working treadles that raise and lower alternate sets of warp threads, creating a temporary space called the shed. He passes the horizontal weft thread through this shed on a boat-shaped shuttle, then pulls the beater forward with a firm thwack to press the new thread tight against the growing fabric. Thump dash clack, swish thump clack, swish. This rhythm is the industrial heartbeat of the Renaissance city. For 10-12 hours a day, the sound continues. The plain, sturdy woolen or finer worsted cloth growing slowly, inch by patient inch, behind the weaver. A master weaver, working on a fine broadcloth, might produce only a few inches a day. The wool 7, fulling, shearing, and the final touch, but the cloth is not finished. It is rough, loose, and full of sizing. It now goes to the fuller, often located by a river for water power. Here, in a foul-smelling mill, the cloth is soaked in a mixture of water, fuller's earth, a clay, and most critically stale human urine, collected from public vats for its ammoniacal properties. It is then pounded for hours, or even days, by great wooden hammers, fulling stocks driven by a water. This process, called walking or fulling, felts the fibers, matting them together to shrink, thicken, and strengthen the cloth dramatically. After fulling, the shrunken, matted cloth is stretched on a tenter frame in an open field, hooked onto L-shaped tenterhooks along its edges to dry under tension, giving us the phrase on tenterhooks. Finally, it is sheared. A cropper uses enormous, heavy shears to skillfully skim the surface, cutting the raised nap to create a perfectly smooth, uniform finish. Only now is the woolen cloth ready for market. The silk, a different genesis, sericulture's secret science now. Let us imagine a wholly different genesis, not from a sheep, but from a moth, Bombyx mori. The cultivation of silkworms, sericulture, was a secret so closely guarded by China that smuggling eggs or worms was punishable by death. By the Renaissance, Italian city-states like Lucca had painstakingly stolen and mastered the art. It required vast mulberry orchards, for the worms would eat only fresh mulberry leaves in spring. The tiny eggs hatch. For a month, the worms are kept in warm, spotless rooms, fed fresh leaves round the clock, growing thousands of times their size. When ready to pupate, they spin a cocoon of a single, continuous filament of liquid silk, up to a mile long, hardening it in the air. To harvest the silk, the cocoons are plunged into hot water, killing the pupa inside and loosening the sticky Saracen gum that binds the filament. A reeler with deft fingers finds the end and carefully unwinds several filaments at once, twisting them together to form a single, strong thread of raw silk or grede. The smell is distinct, slightly sour, slightly sweet, the scent of dissolved insect glue and hot water. Its origin made it seem almost alchemical, a liquid stone spun by a worm. The silk too, dying in the loom of luxury, this raw silk thread is too coarse for fine fabric. It goes to a throster who, on a throwing mill, twists and doubles the threads with precise tension to create the supple, strong yarns for the loom, the tightly twisted organzine for the warp, and the looser tram for the weft. Silk could be dyed in the thread, dyed in the yarn for complex patterns, or woven first into plain fabric. The silk loom was often a draw loom, a fantastically complex machine requiring a weaver and a drawboy who sat atop it, manually pulling up thousands of individual warp threads to create intricate, figured patterns like damasks and velvets. A single yard of fine silk velvet, with its dense plush pile, could take a week to weave. The dye vet eye, the hierarchy of color, whether wool or silk. Most cloth was a dull, undyed gray, brown, or off-white when woven. Its true social meaning was unlocked in the dyer's workshop, Tintoria, a place of steam, stench, and secret recipes. Color was not decoration. It was social hierarchy made visible. The master dyer was a chemist, guarding his recipes fiercely. Colors had explicit moral and economic values. Scarlet and crimson, the most expensive, regal colors, not from a plant, but from insects. Kermes from Mediterranean oak trees or Polish cochineal yielded deep reds. The finest Venetian scarlet used kermes over a madder root base with a tin mordant, a process of 20 steps. True black, the color of sophistication, authority, and austerity, incredibly difficult to achieve, requiring multiple lengthy dippings in vats of iron-rich compounds, often rusty nails or vinegar, and tannins from ochels. A perfect, deep, fast black was a sign of great wealth, blue, from woad leaves in the north, or the precious imported indigo from the east. The vat was a living fermenting brew, maintained at a specific heat and alkalinity, often using urine or lime. The cloth, dipped pale yellow, would oxidize in the air to a glorious blue, purple and violet, the ancient imperial color, now often approximated with less costly lichens, like orchel or through overdying blue with red. The wet cloth, immersed in the simmering pungent vat, would slowly drink in the color through chemical bonding with a mordant alum tin, iron, lifted, dripping. It was a moment of revelation. Hung in long rows in the Tiratoio drying loft, it billowed like banners of pure vested wealth. The dye vat too. The politics of pigment. The dye trade was geopolitical. Control of alum, mines the essential mordant, was a matter of state security, leading to wars and papal monopolies. The search for new, vibrant colors drove exploration and espionage. The color of your clothing literally mapped the trade routes and political alliances of the known world. The tailor's hand-eye geometry of the body social, now the finished. Expensive cloth perhaps, a yard of scarlet Florentine wool, or a length of Lucchese silk velvet reaches the tailor's soul. He does not work from a pattern book, but from experience and direct measurement. With heavy shears, he cuts into the material, an irreversible act of faith and skill. The Renaissance silhouette was architectural, not natural. It was about creating an idealized social shape. For men, the foundational linen shirt, then the doublet, a padded, close-fitting jacket that sculpted the torso. Over it, the gown lucco for scholars and magistrates, or the jerkin for soldiers. Hose, often mismatched in color, were tailored leggings, joined at the top to a codpiece. For women, a long linen chemise, then a fitted kirtle under dress, over which went the gown, with a low square neckline and voluminous sleeves. Farthingale's hooped skirts would appear later in the period. The tailor's hand too. The details of distinction, the devil, and the status was in the details. Slashing and pinking, cutting the outer fabric to reveal the costly contrasting lining beneath. Embroidery in silk and gold thread. Buttons, made of thread, metal, or even jewels, were functional and decorative luxuries. Linen ruffs, which grew to colossal proportions, required elaborate starching and setting with hot irons. Each stitch was tiny, precise, done by hand. The tailor didn't just make clothes. He crafted a social avatar, helping a merchant's son look like a gentleman, or a courtier signal allegiance to a particular faction or duke. The linen foundation, the invisible layer beneath it all, was linen, from the flax plant. Grown, retted, rotted in water, scutched, hackled, spun, and woven. It was the universal under. It protected the expensive outer garments from body oils and sweat. The whiteness and fineness of one's linen shirt or chemise was a quiet but telling sign of refinement and domestic management. Visible at the cuff and neckline. The laws of appearance. Sumptuary legislation, as social fear you could not wear your wealth freely. From the 13th to the 17th centuries, European cities enacted relentless sumptuary laws. These were obsessive, detailed regulations attempting to freeze sartorial social hierarchy. In Florence, a law of 1433 forbade women not of noble family from wearing dresses with trains. Venetian laws dictated which fabrics prostitutes could and could not wear, to make them visibly distinct. In England, an act of 1571 decreed that all non-noble males over age 6 must wear a woolen cap on Sundays to support the domestic wool trade. The laws targeted men's sleeve width, women's jewelry, The use of gold cloth, specific furs like ermine, and even the number of pearls on a headdress. Enforcement was sporadic but pointed. The true purpose was not to curb spending, but to maintain legible social order. In a world where a banker could be richer than a baron, clothing had to announce birth, not just bank balance. It was a constant, tense negotiation between booming commercial ambition and a conservative, fearful establishment thought the whole tapestry. When a Florentine gentleman walked across the Piazza della Signoria in 1490, he was a walking universe of production and meaning. His grey lucco of fine English wool spoke of Cotswold hills, Flemish weavers, and the Arnos fulling mills. The miniver white squirrel belly fur trim on his sleeves spoke of Baltic forests and Hanseatic traders. The crimson silk sash spoke of Armenian merchants, Venetian galleys, and a master dyer's secret vat in Santos. His linen, bleached in the sun on a Tuscan hillside, was spotless. His posture was shaped by his tailor's pads and seams. His very right to wear this ensemble was codified by civic law. Every fiber, every color, every cut was a node in a vast interconnected web of nature, labor, global trade, and political power. As we prepare to rest, consider the profound, tangible connection these people had with the very substance of their identity. We purchase clothing as a finished, abstracted product, its origins obscured, its makers invisible. In the Renaissance, every garment, from the shepherd's smock to the cardinal's robe, was a material biography. It held within its fibers the memory of weather on a specific hillside, the calloused skill of a spinner's hands, the acrid ammoniacal smell of the divat, the silent, perilous journey of a merchant galley across the winter sea, and the precise, trusting snip of the tailor's shears following the chalk line on your back. Identity was not a fleeting, internal choice of style. It was a deeply material, legislated fact, worn on the sleeve. It connected the wearer, in an unbroken, tactile chain, to the rhythms of the natural world, the brutal efficiencies of the global economy, and the strict, often anxious, order of human society. You were, quite literally, what you wore. There is a deep, if constrained, comfort in this material certainty, to know your place in the weave of society, and to have that place literally woven, dyed, and cut into the very fabric that warmed and displayed you. The existential question of who am I was answered daily by the texture of your sleeve, the cut of your gown, the legality of your fur trim. The answer was given to you by your birth, your trade, and your city. The endless, rhythmic work of creation, the spinning, the weaving, the fulling. The sewing was a monument to deep pre-industrial patience. Nothing was instant. A wardrobe was built over a lifetime. Garments were repaired, let out, taken in, inherited, cut down for children, their fabric eventually becoming quilts or rag paper. Cloth was not disposable. It was stored wealth, tangible capital, and familial legacy. A chest of fine clothes was a bank vault. Tonight, let the steady, rhythmic thumb clap, swish of the loom become the metronome of your own breathing. Let the intricate, collaborative, slow making of a world now past remind you that everything in our human world is constructed, thread by patient thread, choice by deliberate choice, and that rest, true, deep, dreamless rest, is the necessary, sacred space between the weaving, the time when the loom is still and the weaver's hands are at peace. Feel the weight of an imaginary wool cloak on your shoulders. See the faint liquid gleam of a silk lining in candlelight. Smell the lanolin, the dye vat, the starch, and then, gently, let them go. The shepherd sleeps. The loom is still and shrouded. The dye vats are cold and covered. The tailor's shears are laid upon the table, blades closed. The merchant's ledger is shut. The city gates are barred. The social performance of the day is complete. All that remains is the simple, soft, undyed cloth of the night, waiting to cover you in its quiet uniform, democratic dark. It asks nothing of you but to be still, to be at rest, to dream, perhaps, of floating on a sea of undulating wool, or of a single luminous thread of silk, leading you deep into the silent, restorative heart of history itself.